They say the brightest lights shine in the darkest hours, and I suppose that's true. When the Homeowners Association slapped me with a 30-page letter that reeked of threatened fines and forced compliance, strictly because I refused to take down my Christmas lights the day after December 26th, I felt something in me crack. It wasn't just my pride or my wallet. It was the mounting frustration of living under the HOA's watchful glare for nearly 2 decades. You'd think a grandfather nearing 70 wouldn't be in the mood for mischief. But when they stuck that notice on my front door, they lit a fuse they never saw coming. Let me backtrack to about 3 weeks ago. I put up my usual holiday display on December 1st, as I've done every year since my kids were small. My wife, Shirley, loved the season. Even though she's no longer here to admire the twinkling reds and greens from the front porch, I still string them up. It's my tribute to her warmth, a promise that I keep the spirit glowing. However, this year, for reasons only the HOA gods can know, my usual string of lights became an eyesore, a violation of the neighborhood aesthetic. My name is Walter Jenkins. I've lived in Brightwood Acres for 19 years. When Shirley and I first moved here, the HOA was manageable. We get a gentle reminder if our hedges needed trimming or if the community newsletter wanted volunteers. But around the time new leadership took over, everything changed. The modest annual fee grew into a burdensome monthly due. The rulebook ballooned from a dozen pages to nearly 100. They had guidelines about the color of your garden hose, the dimension of your mailbox, even the brand of grass seed you could use in your lawn. Still, I tried to play along, up to a point. I'd mow the lawn at the recommended 2-inch height, I'd keep the shutters painted that bland shade of off-white, and I'd always put my trash cans away by 5 p.m. on pickup day. But Christmas lights? That was my last stand. Shirley used to design the display each year, collecting unique ornament bulbs from road trips and rummage sales. She had a fascination for color and sparkle that never seemed tacky to me. Instead, it was the manifestation of her love for life. So I decided, for as long as I could stand on my own 2 feet, the Jenkins house would have Christmas lights through January 1st. I almost spat out my coffee when I saw the notice stuck to the door that morning. Bold letters in red told me I was in violation of holiday display guidelines, which stated that all seasonal lights must be removed by December 26th. Let me highlight that date. December 26th, the day after Christmas, as if they expected every household to pretend the holiday never happened. The letter threatened a daily fine of $50 for every 24 hours I failed to comply. $50 a day, plus an additional threat of further legal action if I refused to remove the lights. They even suggested that the reflection off my house might constitute a driving hazard for neighbors coming around the curve. That day, my phone kept buzzing with messages from neighbors, some supportive, some flippant. A few folks said, "Walter, just take him down. It's not worth the trouble." Maybe they were right. Maybe a small string of lights wasn't worth going to war over. But to me, this wasn't just about lights. It was about Shirley, about tradition, about refusing to let a handful of overbearing committee members erase the little joys that kept me going. I stared at the letter for a while, my hot temper battling the cooler logic of my older age. After all, not many men my age want to pick fights with HOAs. But I couldn't ignore the injustice. The new HOA president, a retired attorney named Patricia Dawson, had turned the association into her personal fiefdom. She'd gone from policing chipped paint to awarding arbitrary citations for vehicles parked slightly off-centered in their driveways, as if we were living in a meticulously curated museum rather than a neighborhood full of actual people. So I decided I was done playing ball. My lights were staying put. Let them find me. Let them threaten me. If they wanted to fight, I'd show them more than a measly row of red and green bulbs. Perhaps I'd been too timid for too long, letting them dictate every detail, only muttering quiet complaints at the HOA's monthly meetings. But this time, they'd messed with a piece of me that was too important to let go. That night, I left my lights on well past midnight, ignoring the scowls of the security patrol that circled the block. If they were going to penalize me anyway, I might as well enjoy the view. My phone rang around 9 the next morning, and it was none other than Mrs. Dawson, her voice tense with a triumphant edge. She informed me that the first $50 fine, was due by the end of the week. She droned on about how I signed a contract when I bought the house and how I was unfairly tarnishing the community's polished image. I told her that I had no intention of backing down. In fact, I had a surprise for her and her committee. She might have brushed me off as a foolish old man with a rebellious streak, but she had no idea just how far I was willing to go. I remember the day I bought this house with Shirley, how we dreamed of filling the living room with warmth every holiday season. I wasn't about to let some petty dictatorship crush that dream now. Looking around at my modest yard that morning, I suddenly felt an electric excitement buzz through me, stronger than anything I'd felt in years. If the HOA didn't like my tasteful, standard display, I was going to give them something truly unforgettable. I spent the next few hours scribbling plans on old notebook paper, figuring out how to expand my usual display into something monumental. And by monumental, I mean so big and bright that folks down at the next county line would see it. Initially, the idea was as simple as doubling or tripling the lights on my own house to send a message. But the more I thought about it, especially in the quiet hours of the afternoon, the more I realized I wanted to do something that would rattle the entire HOA board, including Patricia Dawson, to their very core. When you get to be my age, you have connections you don't even know you have. Over the years, I tutored a few neighbor kids in math for free. Some of those kids were now grown-ups with interesting jobs. One was an electrician, another was a city planner. I made a few calls, inquiring about bulk Christmas lights, generator capacity, and city ordinances. One conversation led to another. Before I knew it, I had a lead on a closeout sale at a warehouse that specialized in holiday decor. They were offloading boxes of string lights, those giant inflatable Santa's LED reindeer, anything you can imagine. That night, under the cover of darkness, I drove my old pickup truck an hour south to a nondescript building. The sign above the door read, "Holobrite Surplus," blinking in and out like it was on its last legs. Inside, I found a gold mine of twinkling goodies. The manager, who was about my daughter's age, almost fell over when I asked if they had 50,000 bulbs in stock. "Yes, sir, we do," she said, blinking like she wasn't sure she'd heard me right. Are you sure you want that many?" She raised an eyebrow, and I just smiled. "I'm about to orchestrate a Christmas miracle in my neighborhood," I replied. "Or maybe a one-man light show for the ages." She gave me a look that bordered on concern, but she rang up the purchase all the same, only pausing to see if my card would go through. It did, albeit with a beep that sounded almost alarmed. My heart thumped as I handed over my check card. 50,000 bulbs wasn't a small sum, and this was on top of the potential HOA fines. But if there was ever a time to throw caution to the wind, I figured this was it. I'll admit, my plan went from 0 to 60 real fast. Once I had the lights loaded in the truck, I realized I needed a place to store them. 50,000 bulbs take up more space than you'd think. Boxes filled the entire bed and half the cab, so I drove slowly back toward Brightwood Acres, feeling like Santa on a mission, minus the reindeer and the jolly laugh. Did I second-guess myself? Sure. A dozen times, I almost turned the truck around and asked for a refund. But the memory of Shirley's smile when we'd switch on our modest Christmas display kept me going. I knew she'd be laughing beside me if she were here, whispering that I'd lost my marbles in the best possible way. Over the next few days, I let the HOA's fines pile up. Letters kept arriving, each more threatening than the last, but I refused to back down. I spent my time planning the main event, quietly conferring with neighbors who either disliked the HOA or just want a reason to see something extraordinary. A few families even offered to chip in for electricity costs. Another pal, Tom from 3 houses down, offered up an empty garage for storage. Every so often, I get phone calls from those who believed I was foolishly throwing away retirement funds on some silly grudge. But I'd smile and tell them, a man has to stand up for something, or he'll be pushed around for everything. That was the spirit Shirley had taught me. Never let bullies extinguish your light, metaphorically or literally. All this time, I kept an ear to the ground for the monthly HOA meeting set to happen right after Christmas. Patricia Dawson was no fool. She'd likely anticipate some grand protest, so I had to keep my real plan under wraps. Still, rumors circulated that my front lawn was about to transform into something out of Vegas Strip. I neither confirmed nor denied these whispers. Let them think I was just going to stuff my yard with tacky, inflatable Santas. The real surprise was far more ambitious. By December 24th, the official holiday, I'd assembled a small team of helpers. My grown children, who lived out of state, had come to visit for Christmas. They were shocked, but amused by my plan. They helped me sort through the boxes of bulbs in Tom's garage, testing strings to ensure they lit up. I had instructed them not to breathe a word of this to anyone, especially not on social media. If one post went viral, the HOA could catch wind and file for an injunction. On Christmas Eve, I put up my usual lights as I always did, leaving them up longer than the HOA's beloved cutoff of December 26th. Sure enough, bright and early on the 26th, I found another letter on my door from the association. This time, it was personally signed by Patricia Dawson. She was charging me $250 for the second offense, and the fines would escalate if I didn't remove the lights immediately. She also wrote that continued refusal could jeopardize the status of my home within the community. A veiled threat, perhaps about eviction or further legal battles. I read that letter in my kitchen, a cup of black coffee in hand, and my heart pounded with righteous anger. "Oh, Ms. Dawson," I murmured, "you have no idea what's coming." While finishing my coffee, I made one final phone call to a buddy who worked for a local event production company. If we were going to install 50,000 bulbs in one night, we'd need professional help, and maybe even a crane. That's when I knew the stage was set. Sometime soon, under the hush of nightfall, we'd launch the biggest, brightest stunt Brightwood Acres had ever seen. I must give credit to a life lesson I learned in the Army many decades ago. Careful planning can make the impossible possible. And that's exactly what this job felt like, impossible. But with the right people and a blueprint, it would become the greatest holiday spectacle this side of the Mississippi. I spent the next couple of days finalizing everything. I was still receiving daily fines from the HOA, but I ignored them. The total was stacking up to an alarming number, but every time I pictured Patricia Dawson's face contorted in disapproval, I felt a surge of rebellious delight. The few neighbors who were in on the secret were rooting for me, cheering me on, and even offering to pay a small part of the fines if it meant seeing the HOA put in its place. By December 29th, the neighborhood was buzzing with rumors. I'd kept my usual lights up long past the deadline, but no new decorations had appeared yet, leaving many folks to wonder if I'd chickened out. They were used to complaining to the HOA about minuscule problems, but I had a feeling they'd never encountered a stunt like the one I was preparing. It was about time somebody gave them a reason to question their blind allegiance to ridiculous rules. On the evening of December 30th, I got the go-ahead. The event production team was available the following night, just in time for New Year's Eve. You'd think people would be out partying or watching the ball drop on TV, but these guys were pros, set designers, lighting technicians, folks who normally rig up massive stages for county fairs and traveling shows. And they offered me a discounted rate purely because they wanted to see me stick it to the HOA. One of them had apparently been burned by an HOA's color-coded fence rule years ago, so it was personal for him. The plan was simple and bold. We'd wait until after 11 p.m. on December 31st, when most folks would either be sleeping or, more likely, too busy counting down to midnight to notice a small convoy of trucks parking near the HOA office building. That dull, gray building, with its tinted windows and impersonal facade, sat right in the center of Brightwood Acres, like a fortress of oppression, as dramatic as that sounds. It was the perfect canvas for my luminous rebellion. We were going to wrap that place in Christmas lights. Every inch of it, from roof to foundation, from pillars to shrubbery, and even the walkway that led up to the main entrance. 50,000 bulbs would transform the HOA office into a living, breathing testament to holiday cheer, and a big middle finger to their rulebook. I was sure they wouldn't miss that small detail when they came in for their first meeting of the new year. To do it stealthily, though, that required some maneuvering. The security cameras outside the building were rumored to be fake, a cost-cutting measure the HOA had taken years ago. But I didn't want to bank on that rumor. We parked the trucks behind a row of hedges and disabled all the headlights. The men used handheld work lights with red lenses, which cast just enough glow to see what they were doing without being too obvious. It felt like a covert operation, HOA infiltration at its finest. It was a mild evening for late December, maybe the high 30s. The cold air kept us alert as we unwound those strings of lights, carefully draping them around the building's perimeter. A local electrician friend had rigged up portable power generators, ensuring we wouldn't blow the building's circuits. The entire operation was choreographed like a dance. One group laddered up the side of the building, hooking lines of bulbs along the roof, while another circled the columns by the entrance. Meanwhile, I supervised from ground level, ensuring we stuck to the plan and didn't damage any property permanently. We might be defying the rules, but I wasn't out to cause destruction, just a spectacle. From time to time, I glanced around, half expecting a police car to roll by or a neighbor to come out and protest. But luck was on our side. Most folks were indoors, celebrating or preparing for the midnight countdown. I could almost picture Patricia Dawson, maybe sipping champagne at some fancy gala or going to bed early, smug in her belief that she'd cornered me. Meanwhile, I was turning her precious HOA headquarters into the world's brightest gingerbread house. It took us about 2.5 hours to complete the job. By the time we wrapped the final strings of lights around the stone signage out front, which read Brightwood Acres Homeowners Association, the structure looked like something out of a sci-fi Christmas movie, an electrified fortress of color. We had everything from classic warm whites to blinking reds and greens, plus a few neon blue accents thrown in. It was truly a masterpiece. I was about to give the signal to power it up, but my hands were shaking, partly from the cold, partly from the thrill of it. This was it, the moment I'd quietly fantasized about for weeks. I scanned the group, nodding to each helper. Everyone wore big grins, phones at the ready to film the big switch on. Then, I motioned for the electrician to start the generator. A whir, a hum, and then pure, unbridled glory. 50,000 bulbs blazed to life in an instant, lighting up the entire block like midday. The building's dull exterior vanished beneath a sea of color, shimmering and dancing in the crisp night air. It was so bright, I swear I saw the windows of homes a block away flicker as if folks were peeking from behind their curtains, wondering what on earth had just happened. Standing there, in that burst of luminescence, I felt something stir in me that had lain dormant for years. Pride, defiance, exhilaration. This was for every petty fine, every overreaching regulation, and every ounce of intimidation the HOA had dished out. And most of all, it was for Shirley, her spirit of joy and celebration, which no homeowners association could ever truly dim. We all stood there for several breathless moments, just admiring the vibrant display. My heart pounded with an electricity that had nothing to do with the lights. It felt surreal, like we just painted the night sky on the side of the HOA building. A couple of us even let out an involuntary cheer before remembering we were supposed to keep it down. At that point, it was closing in on 2 a.m. on New Year's Day. A few neighbors had definitely taken notice. I saw silhouettes of people at their windows, and the occasional camera flash suggested someone was snapping photos. But no one ventured outside, perhaps still groggy from their midnight celebrations. By mutual agreement, we decided to leave the lights on for a few minutes to confirm everything worked properly. Then we shut them off to avoid drawing attention until morning. We packed up our ladders and leftover supplies, running on an adrenaline high that made us feel 20 years younger. I even managed a little jig in the parking lot before we all scattered, driving away in separate directions. I barely slept that night. My mind was a whirlwind of images. The blazing bulbs, Patricia Dawson's inevitable meltdown, and the wide eyes of whoever opened the HOA office at sunrise. When I drifted off, I dreamt of Shirley. She appeared in a swirl of colored lights, laughing like she did in our younger days. Maybe it was just my imagination, but it felt like her way of approving my antics, her gentle reassurance that I wasn't just being a crotchety old coot, but rather standing up for something that mattered. Morning dawned cold and clear. I woke to several text messages and calls. Some were from neighbors who'd driven by the office early, telling me it looked like a carnival ride. Others sent pictures, grainy phone snapshots capturing the building in a riot of color. One message simply read, "You mad genius, you did it," from Tom, the neighbor who had stored my lights. Another text read, "What did you do?" presumably from a friend who was both shocked and delighted. I tried to act casual, making my usual coffee, reading the paper. But my phone kept buzzing, and my excitement was off the charts. Finally, I cracked the blinds and peeked outside. I half expected a brigade of HOA cronies with pitchforks waiting at my doorstep. Instead, the street looked quiet, just the faint hum of a leaf blower several houses down. Shortly after 9 a.m., the HOA office phone line opened up. I knew because I started getting calls from unknown numbers. I didn't answer most of them, but after about the fifth consecutive ring, I picked up. Sure enough, I was greeted by a shrill voice, Patricia Dawson. "Walter Jenkins," she hissed like I'd personally salted her flower beds. "The board is requesting your presence at the HOA building immediately." I couldn't help but grin. "Good morning to you two," I said, feigning ignorance. "I'm a bit busy today." "What's the matter?" Her voice trembled with outrage. "What's the matter? You turned the association's office into a holiday wonderland?" I offered helpfully. She sputtered like a broken car engine, and for a moment, I wondered if she might pass out from sheer fury. "Take them down," she demanded. "This instant. Do you realize the liability issues you've created? The violation of property rights, the potential electrical hazards. I can't imagine it's more hazardous than you fining people for decorative bulbs that have never hurt a soul." I cut in, my pulse quickening. "And as for property rights, well, I seem to recall the association using our dues to maintain that building. Since I pay those dues exorbitantly, I might add, I figure I have a stake in how it's decorated. Just like you stake a claim in how I decorate my house." For a heartbeat, she didn't respond. Maybe she was stunned by my logic, or perhaps she just needed a second to refuel her indignation. Finally, she said, "This is vandalism, and we will not stand for it. The board will be pressing charges unless you remove every single bulb." Today, I felt a flicker of unease. We had been careful not to damage anything, but trespassing or vandalism might hold up in some technical sense if they pushed the legal angle. Still, I refused to fold. "You do what you have to, Ms. Dawson," I said. "I'll be happy to see you in court. In the meantime, I'd suggest enjoying the festive atmosphere. Happy New Year." Then I hung up, my hands shaking. Part of me wanted to call the production team to remove the lights quickly to avoid a deeper legal mess. But I pushed that thought away. If Patricia and her cronies wanted to drag me to court over Christmas lights, then let them. I'd make sure the local news caught wind of it, and hopefully it'd give them the bad publicity they so richly deserved. A few hours later, I decided to take a drive by the HOA office. Sure enough, it glowed like a beacon in the pale winter sunlight. The lights still off from our shutdown the night before, but the building was wrapped and draped in thousands of bulbs. Residents who drove past rolled down their windows and gawked. One or two even honked in approval. A small group of onlookers had gathered on the sidewalk, pointing and whispering among themselves. Parked out front, I saw a police cruiser. My stomach tightened. The last thing I wanted was a confrontation with the law, but curiosity got the better of me, and I pulled into a nearby parking spot. I walked over, hands in my coat pockets, tried to appear nonchalant. The officer, a local fellow named Brian, recognized me from the community. He raised an eyebrow, but didn't scold me. He just asked if I knew who was responsible. "I might have an idea," I said, my mouth twisting into a half-smile. "Everything's safe and secure, officer. No wires were tampered with, no damage to the property. Just decoration. For the holiday." He nodded thoughtfully. "Mind telling me why?" I shrugged. "Sometimes you have to make a point in a way nobody can ignore." He studied me for a minute, then let out a slow breath. "Look, Mr. Jenkins, the HOA is furious, but I can't see any clear crime here unless they can prove real damage. They're spinning some story about you sneaking onto private property. But unless they show me a broken lock or real vandalism, I'm not dragging you in." I felt a wave of relief. "Thank you, officer." He nodded toward the building. "Might want to figure out a plan, though. They're talking about a possible lawsuit. I know you're trying to prove a point, but lawyers can make a mess out of anything." I sighed. I appreciate the warning. And with that, I walked away from the glowing building, half exultant, half anxious. This was far from over. But if the HOA wanted a showdown, they had their stage set under 50,000 bulbs, and I had no intention of backing out gracefully. Shirley once told me, "You can't let bullies snuff out your spark, Walt." If only she could see the blaze I'd ignited now. Over the next few days, the neighborhood turned into a carnival of gossip. Photographs of the HOA building's Christmas wrap flooded local social media groups, though not under my name. People assumed it was me, but there was no official confirmation. The more the HOA sputtered and threatened, the more the story spread. Even the local newspaper's website featured a front-page article. Holiday hijinks, mysterious light display shocks Brightwood Acres. Patricia Dawson and the board tried to damage control by sending out mass emails condemning the act, labeling it immature and a dangerous precedent that undermines community standards. But an interesting shift happened. Many neighbors who had felt stifled by the HOA's constant meddling stepped forward to voice support for the unknown decorator. Some recognized it as a form of peaceful protest against what they viewed as an overbearing regime. Before long, an undercurrent of sympathy for my cause built up. On January 3rd, I received an official summons in the mail, a cease and desist order from the Brightwood Acres Board of Directors. The letter demanded I dismantle the display immediately or face a civil lawsuit. They also indicated they'd be filing for trespassing charges. My hands shook as I read it, but I took a deep breath, remembering the policeman's words. Without concrete evidence of forced entry or damage, the trespassing claim might not stick. Still, the civil case could be messy. I decided it was time to confront them head-on. The following evening, the HOA held an emergency meeting in the community center, presumably to handle the crisis. Normally, these meetings were attended by a handful of bored residents complaining about barking dogs or uncollected trash bins. But this time, word had spread. The room was filled to capacity. Dozens of neighbors, some openly curious, some supportive of the protest, and a few staunch HOA loyalists wearing pinched expressions. I walked in a bit late, feeling every eye in the room land on me. I dressed in my usual getup, tweed blazer, flannel shirt, and an old pair of loafers. Patricia Dawson sat at a long table with the other board members, a row of them looking like stern librarians. She cleared her throat and tapped the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're here to address a serious violation of our community's rules," she began, scanning the crowd as though searching for the culprit. "In recent days, someone has illegally tampered with the HOA office by installing an excessive display of decorative lighting. This act is not only in direct defiance of our guidelines, but constitutes a potential safety hazard. We intend to pursue all legal avenues against the responsible party." Her gaze settled on me. Clearly, she wanted me to squirm. Instead, I raised my hand politely. "May I speak?" She exhaled sharply, then nodded. "Go ahead, Mr. Jenkins." I stepped forward to the microphone. The hush in the room felt heavy, as though everyone was collectively holding their breath. "I'll confess," I said, my voice steady. "I'm the one who decorated the office with those lights." A ripple of gasps and murmurs rolled through the crowd, followed by a quiet sense of satisfaction. Some folks even clapped lightly, which Patricia quickly tried to quell. "Yes, well," she said, eyes narrow, "thank you for admitting it. Perhaps you can explain yourself before we press charges." I placed my hands on the podium, letting my eyes sweep across the audience. I saw curiosity, sympathy, even admiration in some faces. "I've lived here for nearly 2 decades. I began. I paid my dues, followed the rules within reason. But lately, the HOA has overstepped. You fine people for minuscule infractions. You impose regulations about holiday lights that are so strict we can hardly enjoy the season. And when I refuse to take down my simple Christmas display, when I put up every year in memory of my late wife, you threaten me with steep fines and legal action, all for a few strands of bulbs." Patricia opened her mouth to retort, but I raised a hand politely. "No, please, let me finish." She gave a curt nod. I did what I did because I believe the HOA has forgotten its true purpose, to serve this community, not to lord over it. My display on your office was an invitation to the board to remember what the holidays in this neighborhood should stand for: unity, compassion, and a bit of joy. Several people applauded, ignoring Patricia's scowl. One board member, a man named Robert, leaned forward. "Mr. Jenkins, you've created a rather large expense for the HOA now. We'll have to pay to remove those lights, possibly repair any damage." I shook my head. "There is no damage, and I'll gladly remove them myself, free of charge, when the time is right. Or you can keep them up. After all, they're quite a sight." Some of the audience chuckled. Patricia was turning red. "That's enough nonsense," she snapped. "This is a violation that won't be swept under the rug. You'll be hearing from our lawyers." I felt my blood pressure rising, but I remained calm. "With all due respect, Ms. Dawson, you can threaten me with lawsuits, but you'll have to explain to a judge why you fined an elderly resident for having a few Christmas lights in honor of his late wife, and then try to destroy him financially when he protested. I'm willing to bet the court of public opinion won't be on your side. The local press is already covering this, and I have a feeling this isn't the sort of publicity you want for Brightwood Acres." A hush blanketed the room once more. Patricia's eyes darted around, and I could see the wheels turning. She was savvy enough to know this looked terrible from a PR standpoint. The last thing she wanted was reporters painting the HOA as a bunch of cold-hearted Grinches. Finally, Robert cleared his throat. "Perhaps there's room for negotiation here," he said, casting a glance at Patricia. "If Mr. Jenkins removes the lights without damaging the property, maybe we can revisit some of these fines and the lawsuit." Patricia's lips pressed into a thin line, but she knew she was cornered. She gave a reluctant nod. "Fine," she said coldly, "but I want those lights gone in 2 days. And the daily fines for your home display remain. As for whether we rescind them or not, the board will discuss that." I turned to face the crowd. "Thank you," I said simply, stepping away from the microphone. A few of my supporters came up to pat me on the back or shake my hand. The entire room buzzed with conversation, but I noticed Patricia gathering her papers in a flustered hurry. She wouldn't even look me in the eye. Despite her hostility, I felt a weight lift. I made my statement, and it seemed the community was behind me, or at least many of them were. As I left the building, I caught sight of the multicolored bulbs still wound around the pillars outside, unlit in the early evening gloom. They wouldn't remain there much longer, but that was fine. The message had been delivered. The following morning, I returned with Tom and a few other neighbors. Together, we carefully dismantled the light display, taking care not to chip paint or damage anything. A few onlookers from a neighborhood watched, chatting about how glorious it had looked and how it might go down in Brightwood Acres history as the grandest protest ever staged. We packed the boxes neatly into Tom's truck, feeling a sense of accomplishment. Within a week, an email arrived from the HOA. They were waiving all the fines for my home display, as a gesture of goodwill. No apology, of course, but a clear sign that they'd realized continuing the fight would only bring them more embarrassment. The daily fees I'd racked up vanished, and while they still reminded residents of the official guidelines, I noticed they changed the removal date from December 26th to January 1st. A small victory, perhaps, but a significant one. As for me, I store those 50,000 bulbs in Tom's garage, uncertain if I'd ever put them to use again. But something told me that if the HOA decided to bully the community next holiday season, I'd have a ready-made solution waiting. That night, I stood on my porch, looking out at the spot where Shirley and I used to sip cocoa and watch the neighborhood lights. For the first time in years, I felt a renewed spark of hope. Maybe it was the knowledge that one person, even an old guy like me, could make a difference. Maybe it was simply that I'd found the courage to do something outrageous in a world that too often demands quiet compliance. I raised my mug of cocoa to the sky, imagining Shirley there, cheering me on, her eyes dancing with mischief and delight. "Here's to you, my love," I whispered, "and to everyone who refuses to let the light go out." And for just a moment, I swear I saw a flicker in the darkness, like a phantom twinkle of red and green, reminding me that the brightest lights can shine against even the darkest nights. The end.